My name is Diana Samarison, and I'm the founding executive director of the Disability Rights Fund and the Disability Rights Advocacy Fund. I'm honored to welcome you to our side event entitled Moving the Needle on Gender and Disability from Gender Aware to Gender Transformative. This event is co-hosted by DRF, DRAF, Global Affairs Canada, and Women Enabled International. And I'm speaking to you today from my home in Brookline, Massachusetts, which is the traditional territory of the Algonquian Native American tribe. We have 6 speakers with us today from Canada, Indonesia, Uganda, Mexico, and the United States. While we come from a diversity of places, we all come from places where women and girls with disabilities and people with disabilities of diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, or SOGIESC, experience profound and intersectional discrimination. We also come from places where women with disabilities and persons with disabilities who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender are leading incredible work and setting new standards for movement building and rights achievements. And I'm excited that you will hear about their work today. The Disability Rights Fund is a participatory grant maker supporting organizations of persons with disabilities in Africa, Asia, Pacific, and Caribbean to build diverse movements, ensure inclusive development agendas, and achieve equal rights and opportunity for all. Our work is grounded in the CRPD. Since 2008, we have given out more than $38 million to almost 400 organizations of persons with disabilities across 38 countries to advocate for rights. More than 50% of our grant making goes to groups that are marginalized, even within the disability community. We also focus on cross-movement building, recognizing that people with disabilities and all of us have multiple identities and that rights are intersectional. A few years ago, we developed gender guidelines to support work at the intersection of gender and disability and gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. We don't think being aware of gender differences is enough. We want to see a shift in power. We have been expanding our grant making at these intersections, our partnerships, and also our advocacy within the disability community to address power imbalances with mainly men still leading, and within the feminist movement and feminist funding, where mainly non-disabled women are leading. Women with disabilities currently receive less than 1% of all funding going to women. And frankly, there's not that much money going to women. To date, we have given organizations of women with disabilities $4.5 million, making us the single largest grant maker to women with disabilities. While I'm proud of this, it is also not enough. Women with disabilities are more than half of the population of persons with disabilities and are 1 in every 5 women. There are simply not enough resources globally going to women with disabilities or people with disabilities of diverse SOGIESC. At the Civil Society Forum yesterday and during the Conference of States Parties this week, we heard a lot, rightly, about COVID and the severe impact on persons with disabilities. UN Women has called gender-based violence against women and girls a shadow pandemic. We will hear today from our speakers about some of the critical initiatives that women and girls with disabilities and people with disabilities who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender are leading so that we can all build forward better. Let's start with our distinguished guest from Global Affairs Canada, a bilateral donor with a feminist foreign policy, Ms. Cheryl Urban. Ms. Urban has been the Director General of Economic Development and International Financial Institutions at Global Affairs Canada since 2010. Prior to this role, she also oversaw Canada's bilateral trade, political and development cooperation in South America, and has been a program director in Southeast Asia and a policy director with the Afghanistan Task Force. Before coming to Global Affairs, Ms. Urban worked at Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. Ms. Urban, excuse me, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diana. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure to be with you today. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. C'est un grand plaisir pour moi d'être avec vous ce matin. I would like to start by first thanking the Disability Rights Fund for their leadership on this critical issue of the intersections between gender and disability for women and girls in all their diversity. I would also like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Ottawa, Canada, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Globally, 1 in 5 women has a disability. For women and girls with disabilities around the world, disproportionately high rates of sexual and gender-based violence and disability discrimination intersect to impact their well-being and create significant barriers to the full realization of their human rights. Women and girls with disabilities are less likely to access education and healthcare, including reproductive and sexual health services and social protection and employment opportunities. They face specific forms of abuse, including forced sterilization and forced institutionalization. They are among the most marginalized groups in any crisis-affected context. Cette situation n'a fait qu'empirer avec la pandémie de COVID-19. Les personnes handicapées étaient touchées de manière disproportionnée et présentant des risques plus élevés d'exposition, de complications et de décès. Compounded by multiple layers of discrimination, women and girls with disabilities have been one of the most marginalized and left behind groups during the pandemic, with higher rates of underlying health conditions, higher rates of poverty, and higher rates of sexual and gender-based violence than women and girls without disabilities. Despite these challenges, many women and girls with disabilities who have been traditionally excluded from feminist spaces are on the front lines, calling for change around the world, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic has forced decision makers to grapple with systemic inequalities. We must collectively act to do more to advance gender equality and the inclusion of persons with disabilities, especially women and girls, in all their diversity. This is a priority for Canada. In 2017, Canada adopted its Feminist International Assistance Policy, which places gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls at the heart of international assistance efforts. By calling for a human rights-based approach, this policy also recognizes that all people must enjoy the same human rights, regardless of sex, race, income, ethnicity, color, religion, language, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, or refugee status. For Canada, an intersectional approach, which we seek to achieve through our gender-based analysis plus, is central to the Feminist International Assistance Policy and to our international programming. For example, a feminist approach to international assistance recognizes that realizing the human rights and achieving gender equality for all women and girls, including those with disabilities, requires transforming social norms and challenging unequal power relations. Reflecting the principle of nothing without us, We value the lived experiences of women and girls with disabilities and seek to engage them in the design and development of interventions. In 2018, Canada made 7 commitments at the Global Disability Summit in London to ensure that persons with disabilities are able to contribute to and benefit from Canada's international assistance efforts. This included a commitment to ensure that the interests and priorities of women and girls with disabilities are taken into account in Canada's $400 million G7 commitment on girls' education in crisis contexts. I'll also add that as an organization, Global Affairs Canada also wants to embrace diversity and inclusion. I've personally taken on the role of diversity and inclusion champion for my branch at Global Affairs Canada as part of our broader efforts across the department to strengthen the development and implementation of Global Affairs Canada's policies and practices to ensure that they are more attuned to diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. With regard to our work with women's rights organizations, Canada is committed to strengthening our support to these organizations and movements, recognizing that girls and women in all their diversity are powerful agents of change, and that grassroots organizations in particular are fundamental partners in ensuring that our actions directly contribute to gender equality and poverty reduction. And this includes our support to the Generation Equality Forum. Canada is committed to addressing the unacceptably high rates of sexual and gender-based violence experienced by women and girls around the world. For example, as part of our response to COVID-19, Canada provided an additional $12 million to the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, which includes funding to support specific programs to prevent and respond to violence against women and girls with disabilities. In addition, Canada will be running our biennial resolution on violence against women and girls at the 47th session of the Human Rights Council starting next week, which will focus on ending all forms of violence against women and girls with disabilities. Le Canada s'est engagé à atteindre les objectifs de développement durable et de ne laisser personne de côté. Et cette résolution constitue un pas important vers la réalisation de ODD et l'atteinte des personnes les plus marginalisées, notamment les femmes et les filles handicapées. While Canada is taking concrete steps to address intersectionality in all of our efforts, we recognize that we still have a lot to learn. I look forward to hearing the experiences, challenge, and lessons learned faced by our panelists in adopting gender transformative and intersectional approaches to advancing human rights for women and girls with disabilities in all their diversity around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cheryl Urban. I really appreciate Canada for your feminist foreign policy and for all of the exciting work that you are leading and beginning with the Global Alliance. It is really something to watch with much appreciation. Our next speaker, Jenny Rosa Damayanti, is a grantee of the Disability Rights Fund and Disability Rights Advocacy Fund since 2013. And Jenny is the chair of the Indonesian Mental Health Association. It is Indonesia's first organization of persons with psychosocial disabilities. Jenny has been leading incredible work at the intersection of feminism and disability rights. For example, her organization led a successful appeal to the Constitutional Court of Indonesia to ensure that persons with psychosocial disabilities could vote for the first time in regional elections in 2017. And in Indonesia, there are more than 3,000 people and many women with disabilities confined to residential institutions. So this access to vote is so important. And there are many, many other wins that Yeni has had. Yeni, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Diana. I'll go straight to my speech to shorten the time. Hello, good morning, everybody. Women with disabilities activists in Indonesia have long realized the importance of being part of the women movement. The women movement in Indonesia has a very long history. Currently, the political positions of the women's movement in Indonesia is very strategic, and their voices are seriously considered by the government and other decision makers. Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia, there were already several initiatives between women activists with disabilities and mainstream women activists to work together. Women with disabilities were involved in the discussion of the drafting of Anti-Sexual Violence Act, which was initiated by National Commission on Violence Against Women and the Service Providers Forum. At the beginning, there was a dispute, quite a big one, between women with disabilities and women without disabilities over the reproductive rights of women with psychosocial disabilities. The mainstream women activists thought that forced contraception on women with psychosocial disabilities is not a crime. Fortunately, it was successfully resolved through lobbying and advocacy by women with disabilities activists with the support of DRAF. And then after that, women with disabilities activists play a strategic role in campaigning and lobbying for the Anti-Sexual Violence Act, including by holding a series of hearings to the parliament involving marginalized groups such as women with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities. The next action by women with disabilities activists before COVID-19 was to organize a women convening in 2018 with the support of the DRF and the DRAF. It was a constructive dialogue between leaders of the women organizations and leaders of women-led disability organizations in Indonesia. This was then led to a better understanding between these two movements and an agreement to build a stronger collaboration in the future to address gender-based violence and discrimination, both in the mainstream and women with disabilities communities. The Association of Indonesian Women with Disabilities, with the support of the DRF, has collaborated with a legal aid organization for women victims of violence, LBH APIC, to ensure access to justice for women with disability survivors of gender-based violence through collaboration with Indonesian police. This advocacy has resulted in a memorandum of understanding between the police and the Indonesian Women with Disabilities Association, which was followed by a series of training. But COVID-19 came and it brings a new challenges for women with disabilities in Indonesia and around the world. During the COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia, one group that was most affected but also the most forgotten were women with psychosocial disabilities who live in social care institutions. Social care institutions in Indonesia are known as prison-like places where residents experience various forms of violence, such as confinement in cells, chaining, physical and emotional violence, and sexual violence, in addition to poor living conditions, inadequate nutrition, and lack of health services. During the pandemic, visits from outside, including from family and friends, are strictly prohibited, so that they are increasingly isolated. No one knows what happened in the psychosocial institution during the lockdown period. The fate of the women who live there really depends on the workers of staff of the institution. While in the several interviews we conducted, often reported that the perpetrators of the violence, including sexual violence, are the staff of the institution. People who live in the institution were also left behind in various COVID responses by the government. From COVID-19 information, health protocols, improvement of living conditions, social assistance, they are left behind. All of those resulted in the explosion of COVID-19 infection in several institutions in Indonesia. It is obvious that the system of institutionalization can no longer be maintained. Serious and systematic efforts to abolish the system are needed both at the national and international levels. To remove the system is not easy. In Indonesia, it still requires hard work from many parties, including from other movements, such as women movement and human rights movement, to encourage the government to change this ingrained system. That's when further collaboration with women movement is crucial. To address the issue of women with psychosocial disabilities in social care institutions, Indonesian Mental Health Association, my organization, with the support of DRAF, is collaborating with Indonesian Women's Coalition. This is the largest women organization in Indonesia, to conduct joint field research and advocacy to address the issue of institutionalization of women with disabilities towards living independently in community. Advancing gender transformative work means that the situation of people who have been most marginalized when it comes to identity needs to be addressed urgently. And these people are people and women with psychosocial disabilities. The second women convening will be held at the end of this month. It designed to go deeper to understanding the intersectionalities of women issues, find a common ground and collective action towards an inclusive women movement. Joint forces between women with disability movement and mainstream women's movement is essential and very strategic. Further efforts are needed to strengthen the ties and synergies between these two women's movements in the future. Thank you very much. Back to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Yenny. And I completely agree with you that we need to continue to work on strengthening the ties between women with disabilities and other women's rights activists. I want to move now to another grantee of the Disability Rights Fund, and this is Joseph Wandega. Joseph is a Ugandan human rights lawyer. He is the executive director of the Out and Proud Minority Disability Support Association in Uganda, and he's a renowned advocate for disability rights, refugees, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people in Uganda. Joseph, the floor is yours. And you need to turn on, you're on mute. So take yourself off of mute.
Am I clear?
Now we can hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's Joseph Wandega from Kampala. I'm the executive director of Out and Proud Minority Disability Support Association. It's a very new organization, very young. We started in 2018, and we came on board with DRAF in 2020. The Out and Proud is, I'm sorry if I may abbreviate it a bit because it's a bit longer. I'll be using Out and Proud. We started in 2018, and we started working with DRF in 2020 as a locally based organization. We've been faced with very many unique challenges in 2020 and 2021 arising out of COVID. One, there's a lack of concrete data about LGBT with disabilities, and this area in general hasn't been explored by civil society organizations in Uganda. We know that the COVID pandemic at the beginning of 2020 and this subsequent resurgence in 2021 hit our community hard. The disabled persons are not among the priority groups to access the vaccine in Uganda, and yet they are the most at-risk people to get exposure because they are dependent on other persons to help them. And the guidelines and the subsequent laws we've been receiving from the government about social distancing, meaning these people are helpless and they have no one to run to. Secondly, we know that there are escalated levels of trauma and violence with the incidence of GBV amongst the partners in the safe houses where the LGBTI members have been taking shelter. You find some of them fled from their homes. Some of them have been persecuted by the community, and we usually come up with a shelter where these people seek refuge and we coordinate and help each other in their communities. But we've noticed instances of high prevalence of gender-based violence amongst the members. We further know that the cost of sustaining these shelters is escalating with the relief items and all the incidentals there too. We need to meet all the costs, and we've been in the first phase in 2020. Now we're in 2021, we're still under quarantine. So these are all challenges. We also know that the mainstream DPOs and LGBT CSOs have been complicit towards exclusion of the LGBT with disability. We found a gray area that none of the mainstream had brought in the LGBT with disability in their programming, which left them in oblivion and without any assistance. Paradoxically, none of the disability people's organizations in Uganda have been ready to entertain any conversation or even be quoted with respect to issues of LGBT with disability. Most of them saw the easiest way, the easiest lame excuse that homosexuality is illegal in Uganda. That was all, and they wouldn't entertain any conversations from us. This means Out and Proud has a lot of work to do if we are to meaningfully raise the voices of LGBT with disability and realize acceptance amongst the mainstream in Uganda. To start to address these issues and show that LGBT persons with disabilities exist in Uganda, Out and Proud conducted a survey. We very much appreciate the kind gesture of DRAF. DRAF funded this survey and it's already out. I'm sure Jane is going to share it already with us, with members, colleagues to be able to access it. We gathered some data, and data shows that 70% of the LGBTQ with disability respondents were more likely to face discrimination due to sexual orientation as opposed to the LGBT without disability. It further showed elevated levels of exclusion among the mainstream CSOs. For instance, only 50% of the respondents accepted to be associated with an organization of LGBTI. And in fact, among those people interviewed, most of them came from one organization, and as opposed to 30% who belonged to none. 80% of the respondents agreed that access to a decent, safe shelter and health services remained a priority amongst their community. Briefly, that's the data we came up with, and most of it is included in the report. Having that in mind, Out and Proud has some data and intends to develop a 3-year strategic plan with the support from an experienced practitioner to further organization development and institutional strengthening. This will enable us to go through the strategic thinking and the planning processes meaningfully. Equipped with the data and knowledge base to implement the strategic plan, we intend to carry out intensive research and fact-finding about the conditions and problems facing the disabled sexual minorities countrywide, because previously our survey covered the Kampala metropolitan area and it didn't go countrywide. And we think and expect there are bigger numbers of people who are still in the closet, who haven't come out, and they identify as LGBTI and disabled. Out and Proud intends to intensify campaigns for mainstreaming of LGBTI issues into the broader sets of issues and work programs of government agencies and civil society organizations, more so DPOs, other than singling out issues of sexual minorities as a separate agenda, by using the data collected through the survey. Given the difficulties that many LGBT organizations in Uganda have in obtaining official registration and therefore a legal existence, it's recommended that donors be flexible in regard to the way applications and funding mechanisms are structured if we are to meet the expectations and the needs of many of these organizations. Lastly, Out and Proud has been able to realize some of the above stated milestones and expects to accomplish those remaining. This would not have been possible without the tenacity and close guidance we have enjoyed from DRAF in these very precedented COVID-19 times. With that, I sign off briefly. Those are remarks to the Conference of Parties. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph, and thanks for your emergent but such important work in Uganda within the disability movement and within the LGBTQI movement. You're very courageous, and we commend you and your organization for voicing out, including in the name of your organization, which I love, Out and Proud.
Yeah, initially you had made the mistake, you had made it loud, but when you're talking, you clear it from the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm now going to invite Amanda Mcrae, who is the Director of UN Advocacy for Women Enabled International, to speak. Amanda and Women Enabled International are a new partner of the Disability Rights Fund, and we're very excited to build our partnership with WEI. WEI is a critical actor within the women's rights space and holding up the voices and participation of women with disabilities. So Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Diana, and for being able to participate on this really interesting and informative channel. As Diana said, my name is Amanda Mcrae. I'm with Women Enabled International, which is an organization that works to advance rights at the intersection of gender and disability worldwide. We have a long history of working within the women's rights movement to try to elevate the voices of feminists with disabilities, whether it's trying to bridge key substantive divides, for instance, on the topic of abortion and disability, or trying to ensure that the feminist movements break down stereotypes about feminists with disabilities and ensure that their spaces for meetings and for participation are accessible to and inclusive of feminists with disabilities. This is the work we have been doing over many years with some progress. Most recently, we have been privileged to be a leader as part of one of the more important gatherings for gender equality happening this year. It's called the Generation Equality Forum process. This process is a multi-stakeholder process, including states, philanthropic organizations, UN agencies, the private sector, and NGOs. And the goal of the process is to accelerate movement towards gender equality over the next 5 years. There have been 2 specific gatherings of feminists as part of this process, including one in Mexico back in March, and a second upcoming in Paris in just 2 weeks. And I'll drop the link to register for that forum in Paris in the chat box in just a moment. But basically what is happening through these forums is the development of a framework for accelerating gender equality and the development of a series of commitments from a variety of actors to advance certain aspects of gender equality. So far, feminists with disabilities have been somewhat, but not significantly involved in the generation equality process. We at Women Enabled are one of the action coalition leaders on one of 6 action coalitions on feminist movements and leadership. And actually we joined Canada on that action coalition, who's been a great partner there. We have also helped organize a group called the Inclusive Generation Equality Collective, which is a group of feminists with disabilities who are trying to influence the process from the outside and ensure that it's reflective of the views and priorities of feminists with disabilities. But really, these are the only 2 spaces within what is otherwise a really large feminist movement where feminists with disabilities have been involved in the generation equality process. That has presented both opportunities and challenges. One opportunity it is presented is to really make the action coalition we're a part of on feminist movements and leadership one that is inclusive of the perspectives of feminists with disabilities and has made us feel like equal partners as part of that process. And I really commend our Action Coalition for that. Another opportunity it is presented is to be bringing these feminist voices to this international stage, folks who have been used to advocating at the national level, at the local level for their rights, to be bringing those up to and hearing their perspectives in forums and events and meetings where the broader international feminist movement is discussing and really having that dialogue back and forth. This has been a great opportunity for that. We're really happy to be working with Disability Rights Fund to advance this participation. And I wanted to flag for you that on Thursday, we'll be jointly hosting 2 meetings to provide more information about the generation equality process. So I'll also drop the registration links for those meetings in the chat box as well. Just to wrap up, there's just a few remaining challenges with participation in this process and in the feminist movement more broadly at the international level. And one of those is accessibility. We're still fighting all the time to ensure that the information we're given, that the spaces where these conversations are happening are inclusive of and accessible to feminists with disabilities. And we really can't move to the substance of this work until that happens. We also are still dealing with a situation where we're included primarily sometimes to tick a box without a lot of thought about how to systematize our inclusion and how to ensure that feminists with disabilities are integral in the leadership of the feminist movement moving forward. And so we're still fighting for those rights. But with that in mind, I want to turn the floor over to one of our long-term colleagues working out of Mexico to advance these objectives, Mariangel Garcia Ramos. Mariangel is the founder and director of Mexicanas con Discapacidad, or Mexican Women with Disabilities. She has been doing great work on the ground there to work on violence against women, to elevate the voices of feminists with disabilities in Mexico and at the international level, and is one of the folks working with us as well in the Generation Equality Forum process. So Mariangel, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Amanda, for your words and for this amazing partnership that we've created with Women Enabled International. I would like to start just by quoting Women Enabled founder, Stephanie Ortaleva, saying that us girls and women with disabilities tend to be the forgotten sisters. Sometimes we tend to forget that women with disabilities are also women. We tend to be outside of women movement or the feminist movement because much of the spaces are not accessible for us. And when it comes to the disability movement, we need to do more around gender-focused strategies when it comes to people with disabilities, any gender identity, women and girls with disabilities. Also, we're here in Mexico with Mexicanas con Discapacidad. What we do, we're focusing on 3 main things. The first thing is to create networks or tribes for our own representation, finding ourselves, and in like exchanging these experiences and making like this collectiveness around us. The second is around, how do we create and change the narrative? How do we own our own stories and actually be more visible and more present? And the third one is, how can we do more political incidents and advocacy and investigations and reports and put all of these issues on the hands of the government so that they can resolve their part. Some numbers that I could share around Mexico is that in our last census, we figured that we were around 16.5% of the population, which means there's around like 11 million women with disabilities. But we also tend to be the most intersectional discriminated group with the little data that we have, because we have little data. We're less economically active in Mexico than men with disabilities. So, and when it comes to gender-based violence, as I said, we don't have that much data. we know, global, when we've talked about this in different forums and different platforms, that women, 8 out of 10 women with disabilities probably are living gender-based violence, or that we present our risk 10 times greater than women in general of experiencing sexual violence, particularly. And this is something that I believe, and especially at COSP, that the states, the countries are very responsible of having this data, for us to use it, for us to resolve it, for us to work with government. But we don't, at least in Mexico, we don't. But I do also believe that civil society is doing the work that sometimes the government is not doing. For example, in Mexico, there are several organizations that did a gender-based violence survey, and it came out that 72% of women surveyed with disabilities have experienced gender violence. So this is data that we have from civil society, but we don't have it from the governments, and we need them to take responsibility on that as well. Another thing that we've seen as well is that, we were talking about this previously, that the COVID-19 pandemic has become like this magnifying glass in which historically discriminated groups such as disabled people have been left behind when it comes to strategies, protocols, and actions. Even in Mexico, like vaccine, people with disabilities have not been a priority group for vaccination. We've seen how violence has become greater in COVID, especially for women with disabilities. So we need to make sure that we keep on focusing on putting these issues on the mainstream, on the conversation. Some of the things that we've also done over here is, how do we make sure that we keep having spaces like these webinars, or spaces like Amanda said, like generation equality forums, or even our own social medias in our communities, so that we can keep talking and making our issues visible, especially through the promotion of more platform for women or feminists with disabilities based collectives and organizations, so that we can use those spaces and strengthen the power of our collectiveness in order to make sure our rights are ensured, and all girls and women and persons with disabilities can live in a world free of violence, being whatever they want to be in this world. I think it is very important to keep on strengthening, as I said, these collective groups, these women with disabilities, as we call it, in the grassroots, in the organizations, in the communities, because we need to keep on telling our own stories, and we need to keep on pushing these stories through our governments and decision-making agents and platforms, so that we can actually make a collective change. And thank you, everyone, and thank you, Disability Rights Fund, for this space. I think it's very, very important to keep on putting these issues on the spotlight, so that everyone can hear us and we can actually make a collective change together. So thank you.
Thank you, Mariangel, and also thank you, Amanda. I didn't have a chance to say that after your input. It's wonderful to be working in partnership, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you, Mariangel. I would like to next invite Dominique Messel from the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies in the University of Ottawa to the floor. Dominique Messel is a professor and a researcher at that institute, and she does work on transnational solidarity building in feminist movements, and the intersectional politics of women with disabilities in Quebec and Haiti. She is part of the Engendering Disability Inclusive Development Research Team, which is led by her colleague, Deborah Stienstra. Dominique, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana, and hello all. Thanks for having me here. I'm glad you mentioned the Engendering Disability Inclusive Development in your introduction. So I'm part of this project, which is just starting. And in the lead up to this project, 3 years ago, my colleagues Stephen Barani from the University of Ottawa and Eleonore Louis from the Haiti State University and myself, we conducted small independent research in Haiti, and our goal was to provide a first portrait of organizing by women with disabilities and their advocacy work, and that's what I'll be speaking about. So what did we do? We used our contacts within the disability sector in Haiti to identify organizations of women with disabilities that were actively engaged in advocacy. We thus encountered, and I'm translating the names for you, the Association of Girls and Women in the Sun, the Union of Haitian Women with Reduced Mobility, and the Association of Women with Disability in the South Department. And we did not know it at the time, but all three organizations happened to have been funded, and for some years, by the Disability Rights Fund, DRAF. We also interviewed representatives of the main organizations of the disability movement, the feminist movement, as well as state officials in both women's rights and the disability rights sector. What did we find? Well, we found first that these organizations were created because women with disabilities felt excluded from both the disability movement and the feminist movement in Haiti, neither of which recognized the specificity of their lived experiences. So they created their own organizations in order to have their own voice. And this should be a familiar story to many of you. Also, from their creation, which happened in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and very early on in their lives, they set out to defend the rights of women with disabilities. But these were small, local organizations with very little resources except for the energy of their members. Funding by DRF was central, we found, to supporting their engagement and advocacy. So how did they go about doing advocacy? Well, the three organizations started from their knowledge of the lived experiences of women with disabilities, which they saw as jointly shaped by disability and gender as vectors of inequality and oppression. Yet the fact that disability and gender are still siloed in state institutions meant that they had to act on two fronts, that of disability rights and that of women's rights, with different sets of state agencies and movement actors in each. What we were particularly interested in our research was their engagement with UN mechanisms regarding the implementation of the CRPD and of CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. In both venues, they presented shadow reports highlighting issues of importance to women with disabilities in Haiti, that is, sexual violence and access to justice, education and employment for women and girls with disabilities, reproductive and sexual health, and political participation, including being consulted in decision making. All these issues were articulated in intersectional ways by showing that the experiences of women with disabilities were specific, that is, not the same as that of men with disabilities or of women without disabilities. What did they achieve? Well, the concerns they flagged in their shadow reports were strongly echoed in the CRPD and CEDAW committee reports on Haiti. Organizationally, they developed and honed their new leadership capacities and political skills. In the disability sector, as organizations, they gained increasing recognition. And last year, one of their leaders, Swanette Désir from UFMOR-H, was named Secretary of State at the Bureau for the Integration of People with Disabilities. Yet there are a number of obstacles still in their way, and among them, resistances of the feminist movement to include their struggles, a lack of resonance for their issues in the disability rights movement, and limits to progressive reforms posed by the succession of political and economic crises in Haiti, by COVID, and now by gang violence and rampant insecurity. In terms of recommendations, if I can finish on that, our research shows the significance of funding for organizations of women with disabilities. Even small amounts in a context like Haiti can make a real difference. So we do recommend that DRF keeps up with what it's actually doing. We also recommend that DRF finds ways to help them gain traction within the feminist and the disability movement, as they will need strong alliances to obtain reforms in the upcoming post-electoral context in Haiti if this post-electoral context changes the situation there. Finally, we recommend other potential donors to go beyond global declarations and good intentions and to fund the important advocacy work of these organizations, because gender transformative and disability transformative intersectional change needs resources. And these are the people who are doing the change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dominique. Really appreciate your work, your research, and the recommendations, which we fully agree with. I would like to now hand the floor over to my colleague, Apoorv Jain, who will be managing the Q&A. I've seen many questions come both in the chat and in the Q&A link. I urge you to continue to write your questions in either place, and we will do our best to make sure that panelists answer them. And also, if the chat and the Q&A are not accessible to you, you can raise your hand through the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen. So one way or another, we will try to get to you. Apoorv, all yours.
Thank you so much, Diana. We only have 15 minutes, unfortunately, for questions, but I would like to give, first of all, an opportunity to someone to whom the raising hand or the chat function is entirely inaccessible. And if they would like to unmute themselves and ask a question, now is the time. I will just give a few seconds before I get on to the questions that have been typed out brilliantly by our other participants. Yeah. If anyone to whom the chat function was inaccessible and wants to unmute themselves and ask, you can do so now.
Apoorv, this is Jen. You have two people raising their hands in the attendee panel. I just want to make sure you can see that so that you can call on them.
Okay, great. So I can see Joseph and I can see Janita Rukmal. Are they able to unmute themselves?
Yes. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Have I unmuted myself?
Yes, you have. Could you please introduce yourself and ask your question? Thanks.
Yeah, I had a question regarding the funding. If I may recall the previous speaker, panelist, who was talking about the availability of some funds by Canada, the Canadian government. I'm curious to know how they could bring these funds to locally based civil society organizations. For instance, in Kampala here, Uganda, bearing in mind that in the Uganda society of recent, the civic space is being closed by government. There's close monitoring of funds for civil society organizations in Uganda, and it's becoming very difficult for organizations to receive funding. Is there a channel, a mechanism they could use to rig these funds to the locally based organizations directly than going through government scrutiny, whereby most of these funds at times are confiscated, and we find that all the donor money is lost in litigation and baseless cases and allegations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll give one more to Janita Rukmal, if she could be permitted to talk.
Hello.
Yes.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much for giving this opportunity. Actually, my question is for Damayanti from Indonesia. Particularly in developing countries, people often try to submerge or neglect persons with psychosocial disabilities, and especially organizations who are representing persons with psychosocial disabilities. And this is more intense for marginalized groups based on gender, such as women and non-binary persons. So in your country, were there challenges, and how did you overcome them? And how did your organization get its starting step to come this far? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll take one last from Annie, who's also raised their hands, I think. But yeah, if we could please put the other two participants who asked their questions on mute again, or if you could please put yourself on mute again, that would be great. Great, thank you. I think I'm just going to add before I call on Cheryl and Yenny. Cheryl, you heard the question from the participant about how can local organizations access GAC funding without going through bureaucracies. And the other question that I have for you here, one is about if you could give some examples on how new policies are being implemented in key partner countries for GAC. And then also how Canada's funding is reaching women's rights organizations, particularly for women and girls with disabilities. So maybe we can start with you and then I'll move on to Yenny. Cheryl.
Hi, thank you very much. These are some really excellent questions, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible because I know we don't have a lot of time and there are others. Just to start off with on the question about supporting local organizations, what an excellent and relevant question that is. And I had mentioned in my opening remarks that Canada, we have a feminist foreign policy that supports all of what we do, but also a feminist international assistance policy. That policy framework is all about implementing a human rights-based approach. And part of that human rights-based approach is absolutely supporting at the grassroots level and working with local organizations. So this is part of our agenda. It's something that we're starting to do more and more. It's something that we value. And there are different ways in which Canada will provide assistance, right? There's different channels. So we do that partnering with Canadian organizations and big civil society organizations. We work with global institutions like the international financial institutions and multilateral organizations. And then we have bilateral programs where we're focused on a specific country. And in addition, at our embassies abroad, we have local funds. So those local funds are a very easy way directly to support local organizations. But even through the other channels that I mentioned, more and more we're setting up projects where an organization will partner with local grassroots organizations. We can help to build that, and then we can involve stakeholders who as agents of change. Really quickly also, just to provide a couple of examples, if you go onto our website, you'll be able to navigate and see some examples of what our projects are. But just as very quickly as an example, we're partnering with the FAO in Niger. We have a project called Strengthening Local Agricultural Supply Chains. This also is, helping focusing on female-headed households, helping them respond to the COVID economic situation. But that also includes a focus on persons with disabilities. We have a project with Humanity and Inclusion in West Bank and Gaza. And that project is called Inclusive Education for Palestinian Children with Disabilities. That's essentially providing technical and vocational education and training to children and persons with disabilities in that region. Lots of other examples, I won't go into them, but I encourage you to go onto our website. In terms of the question around how are we supporting women's rights organizations, at the Generation Equality Forum in Mexico that took place in March, we announced alongside the Equality Fund and Ford Foundation the intention to create a global alliance for sustainable feminist movements. And so that is working with feminist and women's rights organizations, women's funds and donors. The other thing I wanted to mention about that is it's a good way for us through that avenue to involve the private sector. And that's something that we want to do through these types of spaces and partnerships. So maybe I'll leave my answer to that. And if there's other questions, you can let me know. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Cheryl. And just one quick note, Joseph, is being in fundraising myself, please do, like Cheryl said, check out the local Canadian embassies call for proposals, because I know there's a special fund, a small fund for local organizations, which are specifically only for local CSOs. I'll next ask the questions from Yenny. Yenny, there are two questions. One, which I'm sure you've heard about, how you really overcame barriers which are usually presented with persons with psychosocial disabilities, specifically women with psychosocial disabilities, and organize yourself. And then added to that, if there are any particular tips, or if there are any particular strategies that you've used to address gender-based violence, because that is another question that you could address. So over to Yenny. And after that, we'll go to Joseph.
Thank you. I'm sorry I cannot turn on my video. My connection is really not good. So I'm afraid that I will be cut off by turn on my video. Yeah, I mean, I have to frankly say that it is a very hard struggle to be accepted, not only in the whole human rights women movement, even at the beginning within the disability movement themselves, because we were just an outsider, just before the CRPD. After CRPD, they started to accept us. But stigma is our most biggest, or the biggest problem that we face. So what to do? I mean, I think for my case, it is really, the acceptance of cross-disability movement themselves that can get us move forward. And how do we get the support from the cross-disability movement? Well, I have to say that thanks to DRF, because without DRF that forced us to sit together in the grantee convening, it will not be happening at all at the time. It's about 7 years ago. So it is, I think the funding agencies really play a big role on how marginalized groups such as person with psychosocial disabilities, women with psychosocial disabilities, to be accepted by the wider cross-disability movement. But it's not enough just be accepted. You have to prove that you are, that you are exist and strong and, part of the movement. So you have to know your fight really well. You have to learn really the rights of person with psychosocial disability within the CRPD, and all the general comments. You have to know that by heart, because with that, you know how to answer all the questions. You have you got to be ready to face all the challenges. And so, yeah, I think for my position, first, that you have to really embrace CRPD and left the medical model, which is I was started as medical model as well, and then moved to CRPD, and then really embrace the cross-disability movement to support you. And then in the embracing of cross-disability movement, the funding agencies such as DRF plays a huge role in that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yenny. I will now take up a couple of questions that have come from Harriet at FCDO. The first one, Joseph, is for you, which is, it would be interesting to hear a bit more about Out Proud and Loud Uganda's main barriers that you found in preventing the integration of LGBT issues and disability. And then the other question I'm going to pose to you, Amanda, that I think you could maybe answer both of them for Harriet. One is, in terms of disaster risk response, what are the key supports that we could put in place to prevent GBV in terms of a crisis? And I'm asking you because I know that you've released these guidelines yesterday with UNFPA and UN Women. And then the other one is, how do you think we could break down silos between the women and the disability movement? So those ones for you, Amanda, but we'll start with Joseph. Thanks. And thanks for those questions.
I didn't get the question well, but the brief I had is like linking Out and Proud with a civil society organization.
What are the key barriers which is preventing the integration of disability movement and LGBT movement? So if you could very briefly.
Yes, the key barriers initially, there hasn't been any data. We didn't have any statistics as to based on to create this nexus between LGBT organizations and the disabled organizations. Previously, most of the mainstream DPOs, disability people's organizations, haven't been mainstreaming disability issues in their work. And you find the LGBT organizations haven't been mainstreaming the LGBT with disability issues in their work. So they didn't know about them, and many of them didn't want to include them in their activities. So many of the challenges, the cause of this has been no information at all, which with help of DRAF, we came up with the baseline study, which now sets the basis upon which interventions or future interventions are going to be based on. And we've been doing this by distributing our report amongst the several organizations, the mainstream CSOs, human rights basically, and the DPOs. Though we are finding challenges in integrating them, but we're convincing them with the data and statistics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joseph. Amanda, would you like me to repeat the questions?
No, that's okay, Apoorv. Can you all see me? There I am. Okay. I think I caught them. So the first question was related to disaster risk reduction and the prevention of gender-based violence against women with disabilities during that. As Apoorv mentioned, just yesterday, Women Enabled with UNFPA and UN Women launched a package of materials specifically on gender-based violence and sexual and reproductive health and rights for women, girls, and gender nonconforming persons with disabilities during the COVID-19 crisis, but really applicable to all crises. And so I'm dropping a link to that work in the chat box momentarily. There you go. And I think, there's a lot of work to be done in this context and a lot of international guidance that already exists from which we've digested into a gender-based violence checklist directed at states and service providers about how to ensure women, girls, and gender nonconforming persons with disabilities aren't left behind as part of that response. So I'll just leave it at, please check out those materials because there's a lot in there and it's a very complex topic, to be honest. Beyond that, the second question was about bridging the divide between the feminist movement and the movement of persons with disabilities broadly, but feminists with disabilities in particular. So our strategy with that is really just to keep showing up and keep insisting on our space in those rooms. Our goal is really to kind of normalize the participation of feminists with disabilities in these spaces and get the feminists to be themselves normalizing the kind of considerations for accessibility, accommodations, and inclusiveness that allow us to be in the room for that. For instance, a couple of years ago, ahead of the Commission on the Status of Women, we did a training, which is a big UN event specifically on women's rights. We did a training with NGOs from all over the world about how to integrate closed captioning and sign language services into the side events and the parallel events that they were hosting. We tried to really streamline that process for them so they knew exactly who they could contact to get those services, exactly how to set them up and provide our support for that. We have a series of guides on that as well on our website about how to make meetings and events accessible, including in virtual spaces. But there are also still some substantive divides, and we're working on that as well. So for instance, the feminist movement doesn't broadly recognize the legal capacity of all feminists with disabilities, and in particular doesn't take on that issue as one of its key tenets. Hugely important when we're talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender-based violence, that all feminists with disabilities, all women and girls with disabilities can make decisions for themselves in those contexts. They also haven't fully embraced the right to parent for all persons with disabilities. And there are entrenched stereotypes within the feminist movement about what people with disabilities are capable of. And so I think us continuing to show up in those spaces, and unfortunately have to prove our capability, but just being there helps to break down those stereotypes. And so we're going to continue to do it and try to bring a diverse variety of voices into those spaces. So apologies for the long answer.
No worries. Thank you so much, Amanda. And I know we have only 2 minutes left, so I'm going to give 30 seconds to Professor Mason from University of Ottawa. There's a question about access to assisted technology, especially when it comes to conducting research, which creates essentially a gender digital divide. So if you have anything to say to that. And Mariangel, if you want to comment on breaking the silos between the women's rights and the disability rights movement, but only 30 seconds, because then I really need to wrap up, but I want to give both of you a chance to speak. So Dominique first, and then Mariangel.
Thank you. Access to assistive technology and doing research. I'm not sure how to answer that question, so I'll be very brief. That's not something that we encountered during our work in Haiti. What we're encountering right now is the difficulties posed by the internet capacity, just to be able to have a decent meeting without sound chopping all the time, because we're still working with the organization. So it's really, we're really at the basics in terms of barriers to research and technology. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariangel.
Thank you. In order to break these silos between disability movements and women movements, I think we need to be more present in both movements. Women with disabilities and everything that has to do with gender issues has to be very present in around everything that we talk about disability. It's key. And when we talk about gender issues, we need to be more present as women. And we need to make everything, we need to make sure everything and every platform is accessible for everyone. Because then if it's not accessible, then women with disabilities and persons with disabilities will not be able to be part of the women or gender rights conversation. So I think that is key, and that way we can work together.
Thank you so much for that, Mariangel. And just very quickly on the assisted part, I think DRAF as a grant maker has been very particularly cognizant of the fact that internet access is an issue. So we've been making our grants flexible, and thankfully our donors have allowed us to do that. So that's also something to the donors present in the room, that we need to be flexible. We need to be cognizant of the reality. I have been living in Uganda for 2 years, and I know internet here is very expensive. Technology is very expensive. So that's also something to the donors. I really have to wrap up now. I know there are a lot more questions, but unfortunately we'll not be able to take them. And before I close, I would like to thank all of our panelists, Cheryl, Joseph, Yenny, Dominique, Amanda, Mariangel, and of course, Diana for moderating the session. Our interpreters, Nigel, Rise, Christopher, Beth, and our captioner, Sherry. Our entire DRF team who's been at the back end, Stephanie, Kerry, Jen, Nina. And to all of you, our amazing participants, for joining and asking and participating in such a positive energy, and for all these brilliant questions. Thank you so much. We will be sending an email to all of you with some of these resources, because I know a lot of questions came asking for the links. We will be sharing an email with everyone. In our sign up link, we ask people if they want to be signed up to our newsletter. You also can go to our website, disabilityrightsfund.org, and check some of these resources we'll put there, but we definitely intend to send an email to everyone who participated in this event. So thank you again to everyone. And please stay in touch. Please follow us on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, and visit our website. It's Disability Rights Fund. If you put it, you will find us. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Thanks to all of the speakers. You were wonderful. Looking forward to joint work again. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thanks. Bye.